Hi, this is Dr. Kingston, and in this video, we will be talking about tongue innervation. Our objectives here are going to be to describe the regions of the tongue, so divide it up into separate sections, and then describe the nerves and their modalities that serve these regions. All right, so since we are describing regions, the first thing we're going to do is start dividing up the tongue. The first division is going to be superior and inferior. So the superior surface of the tongue here, which I will outline for you, is going to be called the dorsum. And the ventral surface then down here will be called the ventrum or ventral surface. All right, our second division then is going to separate the anterior 2/3 of the tongue from the posterior third. All right, so our separation occurs right here, right along where these little bullseye-shaped papillae are, little taste buds. And this is going to divide the body anteriorly from the root posteriorly. So let's look a little bit more closely at the dorsum of the tongue, as there is clearly a lot going on here. So in terms of surface anatomy, there are two large sulci that divide the tongue into four pieces. The terminal sulcus is what divides the root of the tongue from the body of the tongue. So it runs here from this palatoglossal fold all the way across that lingual tonsil back to the palatoglossal fold on the other side. The median sulcus then is going to divide the tongue into symmetrical right and left halves. So that is just going to divide us up this way, all the way down. It runs most of the length of the tongue, and it ends just a little bit before the most extreme posterior portion of the root. It's sitting superficial to a fibrous septum that also spans the length of the tongue. So this division persists deep down into the tongue's tissues. And then where these two sulci intersect, there's a small little depression called the foramen cecum. This is actually an embryological remnant that gets left behind when the thyroid gland is formed, but it makes a good landmark for us in dividing the dorsum of the tongue up into these four regions. All right, so that terminal sulcus divides the tongue up into root and body. I mentioned before that the tail ends of the terminal sulcus line up with the palatoglossal folds, which also mark the end of the oral cavity and the beginning of the oropharynx. That means that the root of the tongue sits almost entirely in the oropharynx, and because of this, it's going to follow the same innervation rules as the other structures that sit here. And that is to say, sensory is going to be coming from the glossopharyngeal nerve. You can see in this illustration here that the surface texture of the root of the tongue is pretty different from that of the body. This is because in the root of the tongue, there are no papillae or taste buds. Instead, we have the lingual tonsil, which is a massive lymphatic tissue, just like the palatine tonsils. And it sits on the surface of the root of the tongue. Its surface is rugose, so it ends up looking a little bit rougher, actually, than the anterior tongue. All right, so if the root of the tongue is in the oropharynx, and the oropharynx ends at the palatoglossal fold, that means that the body of the tongue sits mostly in the oral cavity proper. And again, it's going to share the innervation pathways of the surrounding tissue. For the mandibular or the inferior portion of the mouth, this is going to be receiving tactile sensation via the lingual nerve. The body of the anterior tongue is very muscular. It's home to all of those intrinsic muscles that we looked at, and it also has attachment points for all of the extrinsic muscles as well. Its surface has a varied texture, so where the root is just very rugose looking, we have multiple different types of lingual papillae that populate the surface of the body of the tongue. So those are the things that we call taste buds colloquially. And even though we call them taste buds, they actually include some papillary touch receptors as well. We will dive into the different types of these in a separate learning objectives, but the fact that they are different is what gives the anterior tongue its varied surface texture. We tend to think of the tongue as being a structure of the oral cavity, but because that root portion sits in the oropharynx, it's also important to take note of its relationship with pharyngeal structures as well. So to orient you a little bit here, what we're looking at in this image is a posterior view of the pharynx. So this has been opened up from the backside and we're looking in. So here is the soft palate and the uvula. Here is the root of the tongue and the lingual tonsil. And then coming down here into the pharynx, and we can see down into the larynx as well, here is the epiglottis, which has been folded back. And then down here would be the laryngeal opening, and this would be the beginning of the esophagus. All right. So anchoring the tongue down to the epiglottis, there are three mucosal folds. So we have the lateral glossoepiglottic fold coming down this way, and we have one of those on each side. Here's the other lateral glossoepiglottic fold, and then there is a median glossoepiglottic fold. All right, so these anchor the root of the tongue to the epiglottis, and you will note here that there are some small depressions that this creates on either side here. These are called the epiglottic valleculae, or spit traps, as we like to call them. These are going to collect saliva that is flowing back into the oropharynx until you're ready to swallow it. So this keeps saliva from heading down into your larynx and trachea unexpectedly. All right, the ventral surface of the tongue is a much simpler picture than the dorsum, and we're not going to bother really dividing it up into any further regions. You can, if you want, divide it in half using that lingual frenulum, which remember is going to anchor the tongue to the oral floor. On either side of that frenulum is where we find the sublingual caruncles, which are the openings of the mandibular salivary ducts into the oral cavity. And then laterally from there again, we find the sublingual folds that are created by the mucosa sitting over the sublingual glands, and they have lots of little openings for their ducts. Coming up onto the body of the tongue here, we can see these darker folds here. These are the deep lingual veins. And coming off to their side, you can see some projections. These are called fimbriated folds. You can see them on both sides of the tongue. Now, the placement of these deep lingual veins like this so close to the ventral surface of the tongue makes them a very good place to administer medication. So medicines that are administered sublingually or just by putting them underneath the tongue will absorb very quickly through the mucosa here and into those deep lingual veins, and then they move very quickly into circulation. All right. Now that we've got the regions of the tongue delineated, let's use those to talk about innervation. On this image here, I am going to split the tongue right down the center. Everything that I am going to put up here applies to the entire tongue. We're just going to use the left half of this image to show motor innervation and the right side to show sensory innervation, but assume that it is symmetrical right to left. All right, so with motor innervation, this is the easiest to talk about, right? The root and the body of the tongue are innervated by the same nerve, and all of those muscles, except for palatoglossus, all those muscles that move and change the shape of the tongue are innervated by the hypoglossal nerve, which is cranial nerve number 12. So that is, again, all the intrinsic and all but one of the extrinsic muscles. So the hypoglossal nerve, to reach this area, it is going to exit the hypoglossal foramen near the foramen magnum, and it travels inferiorly and anteriorly through the neck. Okay, so we can find it here, and here it is as it's coming through the neck. It is going to enter into the oral cavity by jumping up underneath the posterior edge of mylohyoid. And once it's there, it sends out its branches to the tongue like so. All right, that's it for motor innervation. It's nice and simple. Now, when we start adding sensory innervation to the mix, things start to get a little more complicated. For one, there are two types of sensory innervation. So we have somatic or tactile sensory and special taste sensory. And these pathways are completely separate from the motor pathway. So that hypoglossal nerve only carries motor fibers, no sensory fibers at all. All right, and not only are these different from the motor pathway, they're actually different between the anterior and posterior parts of the tongue. So these sensory regions line up roughly with the root and body of the tongue, with one major exception. And that is here. All right, the dividing line for the posterior innervation is actually anterior to these large taste buds, these valate papillae. The bullseye-shaped ones are a little difficult to see through the yellow here. The division between root and body is technically posterior to these, but the innervation cutoff is anterior to them. So just a little bit of a mismatch. Now, remember that this posterior part of the tongue sits in the oropharynx. The oropharynx receives somatic sensory innervation from the glossopharyngeal nerve. So the posterior tongue does as well. That glossopharyngeal nerve also carries some special sensory for this region. So we have just one nerve supplying all of the sensation, both taste and tactile. To get to the posterior tongue, the glossopharyngeal nerve exits the cranium through the jugular foramen, along with the vagus and accessory nerves and the internal jugular vein. It's going to make its way down into the pharynx by riding on the posterior surface of the stylopharyngeus muscle. So here that we can see that glossopharyngeal nerve right here. I'm going to outline it in green. The muscle it's sitting on is stylopharyngeus, and I'm just going to outline the border of the middle pharyngeal constrictor muscle. It makes a nice kite shape like that. So this slips deep to that to enter the pharynx. And from there, it is going to give off a number of tiny branches that go into the pharyngeal plexus, and then some of those will make their way to the posterior tongue. So, while this area is mostly nice and simple, there is just one little exception, because there's always an exception in anatomy. So the vagus nerve, remember, innervates the larynx, which begins at the epiglottis. And some of its fibers have overlap carrying somatic sensory innervation from the posterior most part of the tongue, back near the valleculae that we identified before. The specific branch of the vagus involved here is the internal laryngeal nerve. So that is a branch of the superior laryngeal nerve. And we can find that on here. Give me 1 second to get my pen going. All right, so here is the superior laryngeal nerve up here. It enters into the larynx through the thyrohyoid membrane. And once it's in here, we have the internal laryngeal nerve that is innervating all of the mucosa here that sits superior or proximal to the vocal folds. All right, some of these fibers are going to travel up to that anterior bit of the epiglottis, so here in the valleculae, and some of them creep forward just enough to touch the posterior part of the tongue and provide some somatic sensory innervation there. All right, so that takes care of the posterior tongue. Now, the anterior tongue is going to get somatic sensory innervation from the same source as the rest of the inferior oral cavity proper, which is the lingual nerve. Now, the lingual nerve, remember, is a branch of the mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve. It originates in the infratemporal fossa, which sits deep to the mandibular ramus. So it's going to travel anteriorly here. So here is where it's branching here, and then it travels anteriorly and inferiorly like so into the mucosa of the oral floor. We've seen a couple of times now that it is attached to the submandibular ganglion, which is a ganglion for parasympathetics that originate with the facial nerve and travel with the lingual nerve into the oral cavity. And then as it continues its approach here, it is going to swoop underneath the submandibular duct and then come back up to get to the tongue mucosa like so. All right, special sensation for the anterior tongue is different. That is carried by the chorda tympani, which is a branch of the facial nerve. To get where it's going, it's going to hitchhike with that same lingual nerve that we just saw. So let's take a look at how it goes about that. As we're going to see in much greater detail when we study the infratemporal fossa, the chorda tympani branches off the facial nerve inside the temporal bone, and it exits out of the cranium into the infratemporal fossa. You can find it here in this image right here. As you can see, it's very tiny, and it is going to descend through the infratemporal fossa to join up with our lingual nerve. Now, remember, this is hitchhiking, so those axons run alongside the lingual nerve, but we still kind of consider them to be separate. So, once more to review. The somatic sensory from the anterior tongue will follow this lingual nerve all the way back up through the trigeminal to the brain. But taste sensation is going to follow the chorda tympani. So this green nerve here will follow that all the way back up and through the facial nerve to get back to the brain. All right, that brings us to the end of the material here. So here is your practice question. Patient reports decreased taste sensation on the anterior right aspect of their tongue. If an injury to the nerve supplying the area is the cause, what additional symptom is the patient most likely to experience? And the correct answer here is C, dry mouth. To understand why this is, we want to understand that the chorda tympani carrying that anterior taste sensation is also carrying the parasympathetics that will eventually innervate the submandibular and sublingual glands. So if the chorda tympani or even the lingual nerve when it's hitchhiking with it is injured, you will end up with both decreased taste sensation and a dry mouth. That brings us to the end. Thank you for joining me.